connecting people should be a mainstream goal of our public services. And I think that the connections and human connections that care about and challenge and that involve and consult and create order and security in people's homes and communities, as Tim mentioned, can lead to a better life. And the home is really important to me. I'm going out and working in people's home. And the home, as T.S. Eliot wrote in Four Quartets, the home is where we start from. And I would just like to talk about my work experience and a walk into Camden, London, where I work. I would like to talk about my journey walking to work in Camden during the COVID-19 pandemic and the memories evoked in me by places as I walk through my clients' neighbourhoods. The artist Lucy Lippard has written that place is a layered location, that it's replete with human histories and memories. And as I walked through my clients' neighbourhoods, their places, I thought about my professional and personal connections with them, intertwined with my personal memories of place and specifically of Camden. As an integrated care social worker in Camden, I decided to travel to work during the COVID-19 pandemic of 2021 and now. And I'm really not even sure how I arrived at this decision. And to be honest, there are times when I'm not even sure that I gave the people I worked with strength and hope that things would get better. I remain somewhat unconvinced that my professional social work experience improved my client's lived experience. But in the book The Plague by Albert Camus, he suggests that disease, separation and death in the shape of an epidemic can come upon us unexpectedly and can come unbidden. And Camus' description of the pain of loneliness during another epidemic is vivid. But I would like to suggest that Camus' account in that book of the overwhelmed Dr. Roux, who, when faced with a crisis and suffering, does what he can from necessary optimism and hope, is deeply reassuring for practitioners working in the community at this time. And to be honest with you, I needed all the help I could get. So I borrowed some of Camus' necessary optimism, and I'm reminded that the United Nations humanitarian diplomat Sergio Vieira de Milo stated that it was always important to be physically present if you want to help in any way you can, especially in challenging and difficult times. And Sergio stated that the real challenges and real rewards are always in the field where people are suffering and where people need you. And I needed all the inspiring advice I could get, and I put on my PPE and I got on a bus and I travelled up to Camden. And I would set off very early in the dark, and I would get off the bus near Charing Cross Road, and I would walk up past Phoenix Gardens and past the obscure and brooding shape of St. Giles's Church. And it would still be dark and shadowy, and the garden and the churchyard were all closed. But I would think of a client I'd worked with called Stephen, who I'd consistently met in Phoenix Garden with St. Giles behind. And throughout lockdown. And Stephen had been diagnosed HIV positive in 1986. and he was symptomatic of AIDS by 1990. And he spoke movingly about stigma and risk and the horrific impact of HIV/AIDS on the community in Camden at that time. And I would think of the way that Stephen swung himself along to meet me on crutches. I would think of his reduced lower body strength and his weightlifter's upper torso. And I would think about Stephen, who sat and talked to me throughout lockdown, who knew everything about any church in London, and who had sung in many as a baritone, and who loved the composer Philip Glass and reading 1930s British detective fiction in the garden. And I remember sitting with Stephen in the garden with a district nurse from Hunter Street nearby, and gently and slowly discussing that his physical health was compromised by the stuff that he'd hoarded and the clutter in his flat. And it was his belongings, it was the old and the worn and the decline and the eroded, and I just thought it was a withdrawn secret world, a violence of hoarded objects. And I remembered as I walked on my way to work what a victory it was when Stephen led us in and finally arranged for a company to clear that hoard, and how we tried to then reframe the situation for Stephen and to highlight his strengths, his unique instances of strength, his resilience as a survivor, and to nurture his ideas, to arrange a concert in the garden. And it seems really appropriate that we actually got a grant for a very nice new red retro fridge from the very charity connected with the St. Giles's Church in Phoenix Garden where we sat. And I remember sitting in that garden with Stephen, telephoning his mother in Sheffield, whom he'd not spoken to for years, and perhaps giving him some opportunity to talk about his father, and maybe to actually mourn a loss. And Stephen started to talk to me about things that at first he found unbearable to share. And as I walk on my way to work, I'd remember that again that Stephen was one of the people who taught that to work with, we have to connect with, and that people grow in conversation and connectiveness and through relationships and not through forms. But back to my walk through Camden, past Stevens, I would continue up to the Tottenham Court Road, and still dark, vacant and deserted, with the odd rumble of a bus and headlights reflected in the furniture store windows, and the strange and gusty whispers of litter, and the constant shifting of cardboard boxes in the wind that cuts down Goodge Street. And I would become aware of the post office tower, and it would be defined at first against black space, and then a kind of impenetrable turquoise, and it would turn to a soft gossamer blue, and there would be small soft clouds starting to appear, and kind of vaporous at first and then drifting. And then I'm aware of this consistent effect of morning, but of dawn, and I would continue past the Indian YMCA in Charlotte Street up to the hairdressers where my client Algalia worked. And I would think about Algalia, who'd worked as a stylist in that hairdressers before mental depression left her frail and ill with COPD in a damp bedsit off Fitzroy Square, and I remember the damp peeling paper and the plasters crumbling off the walls, and the really acrid mouldy smell catching the back of your throat and leaving its odor on your clothes whenever you visited. And I remember Algalia, who talked about the loss of her job, her struggling with her breathing. I remember the moisture, the damp in the room, and I remember Algalia sobbing and coughing, and I remember watching as a community psychiatric nurse with a psychiatrist that completed a psychiatric assessment. I'd been there and I'd witnessed as environmental health officers served one notice on another, and the landlord was completely indifferent. And I remember on one day I'd actually opened the windows because of the smell of the damp was just too much, and I remember feeling the warmth coming up from the street outside and comparing it to the damp in the room. And I remember seeing a lone cherry tree in the street, and Algalia's reaction and rapture when I brought the blossom to her attention, and there it was standing alone. It was so beautiful, and her then starting to talk about her interest in art and her drawings of flowers and getting them out. And then in the following visits, I brought along a large sheet of paper and a ruler and a pen and a pencil, and we drew up a plan, and we pasted photographs of Eugene Smith and show flats, and we wrote lists of goals, and we put down that one of the goals was a new housing association flat, and that college courses and gym membership and regular contact with a mother and sister in Casablanca. And I had no idea at all of how we were going to even achieve even a quarter of those things. But the plan helped us. And it meant that we were on the same side, and it meant that we were deliberate with our decisions. And the damp and the living conditions had really got under Argalia's skin, leaving her really distressed and emotionally drained and exposed. And I suppose I wanted to work with her, and I wanted to consider solutions from the plan as a co-facilitator, and I wanted to give her an opportunity to contribute. And it actually took us 2 years to rehouse Algalia in a brand new housing association flat off St Pancras Way. And sometimes during those 2 years, when she was unsuccessful in an application or after a viewing, Algalia would be completely despondent. And she'd say, "Martin, it's never going to happen. I don't care what you're telling me. I will never move, and I will be stuck here, and I will die here." And I said, "Look, there'll be another opportunity." And I said, "Look, we have a control and a plan and hope." And of course, maintaining hope was an important part of my social work with Algalia and for me, and this piece of paper sustained a belief in the capacity of Algalia to change the negative circumstances and a potential to repair a fracture. Well, I last saw Algalia when I delivered a St Pancras Welfare Trust grant for a new bed and a mattress and a settee to her in an immaculate new flat in St Pancras Way. And the flat, it was a flat that she had believed would never, ever become a reality. But there it was, and there we were. And in that new flat, I remember we sat looking out of the window, and we listened to the ducks and the moorhens and the trains, and the moorhens were busying themselves on the Regent's Canal below. And then we saw this Eurostar train coming out of the international station, and I said to Algalia, "Wow, look at that! Imagine Paris!" And I said, "Put it in the plan." And Algalia laughed, and she said, "Look," she said, "I've still got the plan." And very recently, the manager of the recovery college based at St Pancras Hospital, the manager was called Iris, contacted me and said that Algalia had actually sent flowers to the college, and she'd attended courses there, and she also applied for a fashion program and got on it at the Working Men's College, and she was going to the gym pre-COVID in St Pancras Square. And again, as I'm walking away, I think, my work and my social work assessment, inverted commas, for Algalia wasn't anything to do with a form. It was the visits and the conversations and a joint plan, and it was founded on co-production, and it was founded on shared decision making, and it's slow, and it's work alongside, and it's containment and reassurance and empathy. And after all, when I think about myself, when I think about us, who doesn't have a drawer, a life drawer filled with bad decisions, or with bad luck, or with illness, or grief, and lost people and lost moments, and who among us does not have moments where we feel that we've lost the plot and our hearts lose the will to stand up and move on, and then edit and throw away the bits that aren't helping. But back to my walk to work, and I would continue up through to the King's Cross station, and I would cross it through the south side, and it would be eerily quiet during the pandemic. And as I cut through towards the north entrance of the station, it always seemed very strange that my client Marcus, my client with Marcus with his Father Christmas beard, his bandaged leg ulcers, his wheelchair, and his shopping trolleys packed full of hoarded goods, is no longer there after I managed to move him to extra care accommodation. But I remember Marcus, I remember him so well, and I remember in his trolley that he would sit with. I remember the trolley was absolutely rammed full of wholesale boxes of KitKats. And Marcus was sleeping rough in one of the busiest stations in Europe, with boxes of KitKats in his trolley, because he had hoarded himself out of a house in Brent, and he was scared to attend his medical appointment for fear that somebody would take his patch, his pitch, his trolleys with his hoarded KitKats and the rest of his goods. And as I would walk through the station and he wasn't there, I would remember all these escalating emails and the meetings with station authorities and routes off the street managers and the police. And it took me so many visits to discover why Marcus had so many KitKats, and why these particular hoarded objects were part of the story. And I thought a lot about Marcus in the bustle of King's Cross Station, and the complex relationship between people and possessions. And I work with so many people whose physical health is compromised by stuff, but none more so than Marcus, who had a house full of stuff and now lived in a busy railway station, probably one of the busiest railway stations. And why a railway station? And, in his trolley, beside the KitKats, there were newspapers, there were smaller piles attached to bigger piles, attentions, notepads filled with cross-referencing, and projects that simply did not happen. And I remember standing there talking to Marcus about the boxes of KitKats, and I'd be surrounded by police, I'd be surrounded by security, I'd surrounded by station staff and commuters, and it seemed surreal. And to make it worse, Marcus had stationed himself near the Harry Potter shop, for which there was a large queue past platform 9 3/4. So many of the children would call out to Marcus, and frequently a member of the public would supply Marcus with a sandwich or coffee or cash, and the cash he put carefully into his trolley with precision, according to a system only evident to Marcus. And I kept saying, what about the KitKats? And Marcus' answers about the KitKats were just characteristic of this cheerful, kind of laconic style, when it emphasized facts and details and historical knowledge rather than his own emotions. And he told me, he said, well, KitKats, they had a complex identity and a history which I wouldn't possibly understand. And then 2 more visits in, he told me that there used to be a KitKat club selling pies in London, which is where the chocolate got its name. And a month later, when I again asked about the boxes, he said, well, KitKat was Roundtree's leading product, and that in the war it had a blue wrapping, and that the milk was removed due to food shortages. And then after the war, it went back to the red wrapping. And it wasn't until 2 months had passed that he finally answered my question as to why he had so many KitKats. And he said that his father, who he described as usually mean and cruel, habitually brought him one from a machine at Victoria Station. So I gave Marcus books, newspapers, and a brochure on extra care sheltered housing. I suppose you could say I increased his hoarding, but I did have a plan. And I'd arranged for somebody to guard the shopping trolley, and I took him to view that extra care sheltered flat and to hospital appointments. At the panel, the same manager who had allocated me to Marcus blocked Marcus's application, and he said that he was ordinarily resident in Brent, not Camden. And I then appealed with proof that Marcus had been living in that station, in King's Cross Station, for 5 years. And I sought support, and I got support from a Roots Off the Street service manager, Emily, and she really helped me. And Marcus is still there. He's still in extra care sheltered accommodation, and I visited him many times. He's very comfortable. He still asks for an extra portion of lunch, which he then hides in his room. So my own identity as a social worker, as a practitioner for London Borough Camden, is intimately tied to my own memories of placing Camden, but also with the collective and social memories of its citizens, its neighbours, its ethnic communities, its families. And I'm reminded of this even on a routine journey between home and work. But I'm still walking, and it is still morning, and I've now walked from Charing Cross Road, Fitzroy Square, down into King's Cross, along the Regent's Canal and over Primrose Hill to my first visit with Mustafa, who is desperate to be rehoused. And I know that Mustafa lost his wife when he was younger, but I also know that he used to be a professional chef. On my way to his flat, I look down over Primrose Hill and Regent's Park, and in the distance you can just make out Marylebone and Bloomsbury and Holborn and even Covent Garden and down towards the river. And as I'm looking at this, I reflect that a recipe might actually be a good starting point for a conversation with Mustafa. The British geographer Dennis Cosgrove has defined landscape as the external world mediated through human subjective experience. Geographically today, I have walked past 3 clients on the way to a new one. As the light clouds scurry over the Shard and the London Eye, I am mindful that we live in challenging and difficult times. But Mustafa's expertise and lived experience as a chef might be that very key to a relationship where I can work with him to improve his well-being and possibly, very possibly, change his accommodation. And as I turn away from Primrose Hill towards Swiss Cottage and the Camden and the places that I love, I reflect that regardless of Bion, regardless of Freud and Maslow and the myriad of theories I've been trained in as a social worker, and the recording systems I use and the safeguarding meetings I attend and the processes and procedures of adult social care, the only thing I really know for sure is that the quality of the relationship between the person seeking and receiving help and me giving help is the key to what kinds of outcomes and opportunities in the home, in the place, are achieved together. And that, as Sergio stated, it really is that the real challenges and rewards are always in the field where people are suffering and where people need you. That, perhaps, as Albert Camus had written, that all truly important questions come down to individual kindness, that most people are better than you think. You just need to give them opportunity and a plan. And so the beginning is my end. And as we grow older, we know that the world becomes stranger, but we still will carry on, and we will still carry on walking to work, and we will still carry on exploring. And maybe there is only the trying, and maybe the home, the place, is where we start from. Thank you very much.